Hey there, crewmates. Gabe from Nexus Core here with another One Piece card game video. I am very excited for this one because, as of now, this is the first event we can go over after the release of Set 2 to take a look at how the meta has shifted. There have been a couple of smaller scale events here or there, but this is the first one I wanted to go over because, as you can see in the post, that this event had a total participant count of a 130, and we've also looked at the NX Championship recently after the release of Set 1, so this I think is a pretty large scale event that's worth going over with the data pool, and I want to say thank you to Anthony Weber and the One Piece TCG New York Facebook page for being able to provide the results for this event. So let's just get started right with everything. So I want to apologize in advance. I believe the location for NX Gallery is in Thailand. I'm sorry if I get that wrong. I'm not going to try to pronounce anybody's names because I am going to mess that up and I don't want to do that. So I apologize in advance. And congratulations to everybody for making this top 16. So the first list we see is already quite interesting. We can already tell that it is actually a hybrid list of the Kaido that we've been seeing do quite well from Set 1, but it also incorporates quite a bit of the Impel Down support cards. We have Hannibal to check top 5 for any Impel Down card, which I think does make sense for Kaido, because for Beast Pirates, there aren't really any consistency cards besides Queen, so being able to get more resources is always good. We have a low-cost blocker that is searchable off of Impel Down. I believe that's Domino. I'm forgetting a lot of these names, and I'm not going to bother looking it up for the sake of making this video not last 3 hours. They're also, of course, running 3 copies of Higurashi. I think it makes sense that they're running 4 of Domino just because it is searchable off of Hannibal. They're also running 4 copies of Sadie, which I think makes sense because it's a 2,000 counter, that because it's searchable off of Hannibal, being able to search that is quite good. They're opting to only run 1 copy of Uta. I'm not sure how I feel about that. It's probably just a space issue. As you can see below, there is quite a heavy amount of high-cost cards, but I think Uta being a good blocker is good enough on its own, and if you're only going to run 1, I feel like you might lean towards just wanting to run another 2K like Ulti instead, because as you can see, they are only running 3 copies of Ulti. So I feel like just for the consistency, you'd rather go 4 and 0 or something, but I mean, they were the one that got top 16, so what do I know? They are also opting to run 4 copies of Magellan, which I actually think is quite interesting, and I think it does make a lot of sense, actually, because Magellan, in the Beast Pirate deck, provided you open up Onigashima, his -1 Dawn ability isn't a minus, so you do not suffer from them on tempo, because you can just get it back with Onigashima, and it's just a way to mildly slow down your opponent while you wait to get to your big guys, and it's another card that you can search off of Hannibal, and if you don't want to play it, it's a card you can discard off of Queen, which as obviously they're running 4 of, so I think that definitely makes a lot of sense there. We're opting to run 4 copies of Drake, which definitely makes sense, 2K counter, and also the on-play to make your opponent discard, always solid. They're running 3 of the size 6 king and 1 of the cost 7 king. I think this makes sense. I think out of this set, we're getting a lot more of decently high cost cards like 4 cost, so being able to hit the 4 cost with the 6 cost king definitely makes sense. Also, it being lower on the Dawn curve because it doesn't cost 7 is definitely helpful. Like if you go second, you go from 6 to 8. So if you were playing if you had the 7 cost king, you couldn't, say, play a Domino alongside it, but with the 6 cost, you could. They're also opting to run 1 copy of Urashima, who is a vanilla 7K, 1 cost 9,000. I think this makes sense also. Just being able to hit for 9K is always really good, and it's another card that can natively hit the 8 cost Kid, which, while I don't think this deck was struggling with, I think is still good to take into consideration. Also, 1 copy of Douglas Bullet, which is another solid finisher. Blockers are definitely making their way known, and being able to rest 2 of them and then hit with a double attack on a 10K is very, very solid. And then the usual suspects of 3 Kaido and 3 9 Kaido and 1 of the board wipe Kaido. I think that ratio definitely makes sense, and it's definitely a holdover from set 1. And for the events, they're running 4 copies of Blast Breath. Obviously, it's a one cost that gets you 4,000 encounter, and one of the Brachio Bomber, which I think is an interesting choice. I would have expected them to run the new smaller Brachio Bomber, that it can only hit a smaller card, but you still get the Dawn because it costs... The Elephant's Marchu, it's not new, but... because I think a lot of these blockers you can see are lower in cost, but I mean, one definitely makes sense, and it has a decent trigger if it happens. It's definitely an interesting tech choice, and I think this build runs a lot of stuff in the tech slot, which I think is kind of interesting and makes for pretty variable gameplay depending on how you draw. And then, of course, for Onigashima, you would never be running less than any of this. And I think it makes sense that they're not running the Impel Down. Impel Down and only checking the top 3 when you're only running 4, 8, 12, 16 might not be the best, and also because you can only have one stage, you're never going to put Impel Down over Onigashima. The next list is another Kaido, who, this one, as we can see immediately, this is actually a pure Beast Pirate. There are no Impel Down cards. There's actually no cards from set 2. This is just very, very get in, get out. We have a lot of low-cost blockers with Black Marie and Higurashi. Jack for some extra Dawn ramp. They are opting to run for Uta and for Ulti for that guard. For Sasaki, who also has 2k counters, they're maxing out on the 6-cost King and a second 7-cost King, just so you can always have them out. One tech in 8-cost Kaido, it makes sense because at the end of your turn you get to Dawn ramp 1. So with all of these big guys that are also going to probably make you go Dawn minus, being able to get one back is great for accelerating. And then, again, usual suspects 3 and 2, which they're definitely leaning heavier into the higher end of the Dawn curve. And they are very, very stringent with the events. They're only running 4 Blast Breath, which I honestly think with this build makes sense. There's plenty of 2k counters with Ulti and Drake. They have access to the 4-cost counter for Blast Breath. There's plenty of blockers as well, and because of how many big guys there are, you're probably not going to be having a lot of Dawn for your counters anyway, so might as well just go in for the kill. So I think this makes sense, and is something that we should be understanding from the Kaido holdovers of set 1. Next is another Kaido list. Fantastic. Love the current meta. And this one's another pretty interesting one with a lot of Tecton slots. And as we can see, once again, there are no Impel Down cards in it. They're running 2 copies of Buena Festa. The only film cards are Ulti and Bullet, so it's probably just for the 2k counter. They are opting to run in 2 copies of, I believe this is Seimaru, which gives all of your Kurizumis, they can't be KO'd by battle, so just more protection for help you reuse the blocker. They're teching in 1 copy of Who's Who. I think it makes sense just to kill stuff early game with heavy rush decks in like red and being able to stop red green law. This definitely makes sense. And stuff that we should be expecting for Sasaki because of the counter, for Ulti because it's a good blocker, for Uta because it's a good blocker, for Ulti because it's the 2k cost, for Queen for the consistency, 2 Drake probably for the space. Honestly, I'd probably lean towards the... actually, I think this makes sense. 2 Drake for its ability, and if you really need to hit something like a Momonosuke or a Bonnie early, you could play Buena Festa, maybe get the search and attack with it. And then the first thing that's interesting that I'm noting is they're running 4 copies of the 10-cost King, or Kaido rather, which I think that's very, very heavy. You never really... I'm guessing they're expecting a very heavy board presence meta, and you're just wanting to get the most out of these trades as possible, being able to use it consistently. But because it goes Dawn -6 and it costs 10, you're rarely ever going to be using this twice in a game. So I think is probably the most questionable thing about this. But I mean, if it worked out, it worked out. But this is a very, very high Dawn ramp. They're running a total of 8 cards of 8 and above and 13 of 6 and above. So I think this can just get way, way too prone to bricking. So I'm a bit concerned with that. But they are opting to run more events. They're running, it's from the film deck, I forget its name. It's like Lion's Song or something. You go Dawn -2 to KO, something of, I believe, 5 or less. I was kind of wondering why we weren't running this earlier. I know it was Dawn -2, but you're able to get another KO for 3 Dawn, which I always thought was pretty good. So I think a lot of these... I think the biggest thing that I'm curious about and would like to know is how well the high Dawn ramp worked out here, because it does seem at least a little bit concerning of not being able to do anything for the first 3 turns of the game, but if it worked out, it clearly worked out. 4 Kaidos in a row. We love to see it. And this is, once again, not involving any of the Impel Down cards. This is all set 1 in the film start deck. This is actually another thing of note for the meta, because the first thing that catches my eye, 4 of the 9 cost Kaido and 4 of the 10 cost Kaido. I guess the meta is looking like you just absolutely want to be drawing into them every time if possible. Who cares if it's early? And I guess if you're opting to run in multiple copies of Jack, discarding the excess makes it less of a problem. Opting to run in more copies of Brachio Bomber for the kills, and then a lot of the usual suspects. We got the low cost blockers, the 2k counters. There's no copies of Uta, which I do think is a bit interesting, but for the sake of having these high Dawn costed cards, I think it makes sense. So I think this is another... I keep saying this list makes sense when all of these lists have a lot of differences, but I think that's one of the things, just to interrupt the flow of this, is that I really like about the One Piece card game right now, is there doesn't seem like there's really any wrong answers. There's so many, like, effective ways to build the same deck that it really, really depends on pilot skill, which I just I love to see that. And our first non-Kaido leader, thankfully, is going to be Luffy, who is running some cards of set 2, but it's quite a few. I believe the only set 2s are the Little Oars Jr. and the, I believe that's Vista, who is an on-play KO something, so it's kind of like Robin. This, by and large, is what we would be expecting from a mono Luffy deck. You have 4 Nami for the consistency. I'm surprised there's only 3 of the attached Dawn Nami, just to reuse as much as possible. They're opting to run 2 copies of the 6-cost Rush Luffy. Actually, this isn't what we're expecting. They are not running any copies of the 5-cost Rush Luffy from the start deck, which I think is a very, very interesting choice, and I'm extremely curious about that. I don't really know why you would be wanting to do like these 2 Luffys over that, or the 1 copy of Oars. Maybe the 9k really helps with like the kid matchup, or being able to hit against all of the Kaidos we're seeing. But we are also obviously running 2 copies of Diablo Jean, but maybe that's why they're not running the 5-cost Luffy, just because being able to give things ignore blocker is already good enough. 2 copies of Saba Odi for additional consistency. I would have expected 4, but hey, I guess there are a couple non-Straw Hats, so maybe just to be extra safe. And then 4 copies of Jet Pistol, obviously, and then 4 copies of the Rush Zorro, and the 2 counter Sanji. So a lot of this, I am most curious about the lack of 5-cost Luffys, but I think a lot of this does make sense, and is what we've been seeing from Set 1 holdovers. And this deck is running very, very few cards from Set 2, which I think makes sense. Most of the red cards were just catered towards Whitebeard. I would have expected some of the 1-cost red cards, like Dodon and her crew, because we do have 4, 8, 11, 15 of those in this deck, but I mean, maybe they just didn't feel the need for it. I think a lot of them are even in that build situational, so I think it's pretty interesting how very few cards from Set 2 even made it here. Next, we have our first Whitebeard list, which is our first leader from Set 2, which I'm really glad it's not just going to be the Set 1 meta. And it is Whitebeard, which I'm happy about because I love the Whitebeard deck. So I think a lot of this makes sense as somebody who's been testing a lot of Whitebeard. For Whitebeard, just to never have to take damage from its skill. For Ace to guarantee the rush with it, which is always good. For Jozu because it has the 2k counter, for Marco because it's a Whitebeard blocker, 3 copies of Vista, which I think is for the counter and also getting an early kill off if you need to, 4 copies of Zorro because SR Zorro is just that good. The early game rush is always nice. Tama and Makino, mostly just for the counters. I'm actually interested in that they are running the Whitey Bay. Maybe it's for I mean, there are a lot of decks like in green that run the 1-cost counter, so being able to answer that with Whitey Bay I think makes sense. I'm actually quite interested in the decision to run any copies of Nami at all. As we can see, the only Straw Hats are Chopper, Zorro, and the Radical Beam, which is a total of 12 search targets in the deck of 50, which I think is even for checking the top 5, is a bit on the riskier side, but I mean, it's a 2k hitter, so playing it isn't the worst thing in the world, and if you get something good out of it, that's always great, and it is added consistency just to get more cards, which never hurts. In the events, what definitely makes sense here, obviously for Radical Beam, the deck damages itself, so why wouldn't you want the thing that becomes a Blast Breath at 2? I'm surprised by only running 3 copies of the We Are the Whitebeard Pirates, because I thought you would have wanted more consistency and run at least a 4th copy of that. I would have at least expected 1 Nami and 4 of this, just for the sake of getting all of these Whitebeard cards. So I think that's one thing that I do find interesting, especially because it also has a trigger, which accounting for triggers is always questionable in theory, but it has a trigger over not having a trigger. And then 2 copies of the Moby Dick, which I think makes sense. Just the amount of power this card can generate in the late game is so good. So I think this is a list that I'm actually very happy with, and I think I want to actually try something like this out, because I wasn't looking into Vista or Makino or Whitey Bay, so I'm actually going to try this one out for myself. I'm glad that it managed to do well. And our first Kid list, which there were so many Kaidos, I forgot Kid was supposed to be the best deck out of set 1. And I think this is pretty par for course for a Kid list. Low on the events to keep the Kids alive. I'm actually surprised there's only 2 copies of the 8-cost Kid. I guess wanting to maximize the early game makes sense. The thing that I'm also surprised about is the events. There's only 2 copies of Punk Gibson. I thought we would want to max out on 4, and there's no copies of Paradise Totsuka, which I am surprised by when you are running a copy of the 7K Kid, and being able to restand that, but it looks like we're just mostly going for character defense. They're also not running any copies of the 5-cost Law, which I think is quite interesting. I'm guessing the theory behind that is because it costs 5, and this deck actually doesn't really care about the shamblesing of bouncing and playing something else for the most part, so I guess the 5 cost was just a bit heavy and wanting to go lower on the characters for that. They are opting to run Straw Sword, so resting a big blocker is always helpful. And then being able to rest some more with Kiku and then attack it with Hawkins is always good. Obviously, the killer for the defense, Drake for being able to kill smaller things. Yeah, I think this is a pretty interesting... It's not a revolutionary Kid deck, but I do think it's a bit of a departure from what we've seen just with the lowering of events and the maximizing of all these characters. So, yeah, I think this is a solid Kid list. I can see why it would make top 16. Next, our second deck from set 2, which is Ivankov. I'm not going to lie, a bit surprised by that, because if you watched my video on the blue cards from set 2, I might have undersold the Eva cards. So I think a lot of this immediately does make quite a bit of sense. Ivankov for the draw 2 at the end, low-cost blocker, added consistency from the Doflamingo. Buggy lets you search for all of your impel down cards. Alvida is a 2k counter. More sculpting with Doflamingo is always good. A solid blocker with both Inazuma and Galdino. 2k counter and more drawn drop with Mihawk. A decent vanilla with Crocodile, which I think makes sense because blue does struggle hitting over some big guys. Another 2-cost counter for Bentham, and then 4 copies of both Eva and 6-cost Luffy, and then 3 copies of Mihawk, and only 2 events. I'm actually kind of interested in that. This deck obviously is all about spamming the board with the Ivankov and Luffy combo, so just maximizing that consistency. I think just getting that board out is really, really good. But because that's the play, I'm surprised that the event of choice is Deathwink, because it's a good event, but it does cost 3. I would have expected it's not Gum Gum Storm, but it's the 0-cost event that while you have to discard, it's a 3-cost counter for 0. Or, yeah, so I'm a bit surprised by that, but I'm actually kind of happy to see Ivankov work, because I'm glad that Ivankov is doing well in the meta, just because I love Ivankov. And yeah, I think this is pretty interesting. I think the deck is mostly successful because you have all of these consistency boosters with it, both the native Ivankov cards themselves, but as well as the Doflamingos, just to guarantee being able to use Ivankov. If you are able to get the 7-cost Ivankov into Luffy and do that twice, so you have 2 of each on board, that is pretty deadly. So I think that's how the game it really closes games out. But on to the top 8. First, we have our first representation of the Doflamingo Warlords. Glad to see this deck is doing quite well. I think, similarly to previous lists, this is kind of what we've come to expect. The thing that surprises me the most is there are no copies of Sentomaru, and they've decided to lean in towards to upping the costs of counts of Doflamingo and Mihawk. I think that makes sense. The Sentomaru thing is concerning just because it's so much good advantage, but because of how many big things there are in the meta, being able to hit things over in blue is somewhat important. And Doflamingo is a +1 on its own, so getting that advantage is pretty easy, especially when you have things like Gecko Mori to filter out from the grave. And then you have the usual cards that let you draw, like Boa Hancock and Mihawk for the counter, Perona, Doflamingo, and Doflamingo for added consistency. So I think this is what a solid set 2 Doflamingo list would look like. I'm actually surprised they are opting to run any events, and the only event is the Love Beam. I would have expected maybe some Desert Spada just for the consistency, but I guess when you have something like Kuma as well, you have that in a body, so I think it makes sense. Next, we have another Doflamingo Warlord list, which I think is quite interesting, that 2 made it in, and I think this is another take that definitely makes sense. You're really maximizing all of these 4 costs to get the most out of your blinding Doflamingo. They're opting to run the 4-cost Mori just because it's a vanilla. That's a Warlord that you can cheat out. Again, no Sentomaru, but they are running 4 of each, 4 of the beater Pacifista. I'm surprised that there are none of the blocker Pacifistas or the Sentomaru when you're running Pacifista to begin with, but having all of these things that can hit high numbers I think is very important, and more important than stalling out with a Sentomaru getting a blocker. So I think I can see the idea behind that. Next, we have our first blacklist for Smoker. I'm glad that we're actually seeing some more set 2 leaders out of this. And I think a lot of this makes sense. You have all of the low-cost counters and blockers with in black that we've seen. We have all of these low to the ground cards are really great for defense, which makes sense because black is definitely a mid-range color. Obviously, 4 of the Borsellino, as it's an amazing blocker, and 4 Kuzan for the draw and the cost reduction. 2 Garp, I think, makes sense because the KOing by effect involves discarding. You tend to need to care about your resources a lot, so I think it makes sense that you only want to run 2. 1 of the Smoker because it's a great beater. Having double attack when your opponent has a thing that's at 0 is good, especially on a 7k body, and the fact that it can't be KO'd by effects I think is very, very solid. I think 3 Sakazuki makes sense. I'd probably lean towards 2 just because of the curve, and you are running the Garp, but being able to hit something for on play as well as having the 7k base is very good. 2 copies of Kuzan I think makes sense. It's a fantastic card that you want to run. I wouldn't want to run more though just because of how high cost it is. And then it's running quite a bit of events as we can see. They're running Flame Eruption, which is the draw and give something cost -2. 2 of the Impact Wave, which lets you KO something of a low cost, so it's kind of a better black version of Punk Gibson, which definitely makes sense. I actually do not know what this event does. I think it's another cost reduction or a way of getting draws. I do not know. Someone let me know in the comments if I haven't Googled it by the end of the video. And then they're running 2 copies of Marineford. I think it makes sense. You don't want to get clogged with it, even though you do have some cards to discard. You don't have many. And Marineford's great just for consistent cost reduction, just to get those small things out. So I think this definitely makes sense for a Smoker list. And then another Smoker list. Awesome. And then very similar to the last one, actually, just with slightly smaller amounts. They've decided to maximize everything. I actually forgot that the other deck was not running any copies of Hina, who I was surprised by because she is a fantastic blocker. They're upping the copy of Smoker just because of how hard it can hit. They are opting to go the 3 Kuzan route just to guarantee seeing it and get that consistency. And they are running 2 copies of this event. You know, I'm actually going to do my due diligence and actually look up what this card does, because I think that's only fair that I actually know what I'm talking about. My bad. Love the professionalism that is this channel. Alright, so it is Meteor Volcano, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with the cost of 1 or less. Okay, that makes sense. Then, because you can get things down to 0 quite easily, especially with Kuzan. And while you are sending it to the grave itself, the fact that you don't need to discard off of it, and it's just a 2-cost kill anything, the fact that you could theoretically take an 8-cost, reduce it to 0 by comboing things like Kuzan, Tashigi, and so on, and kill something for 2 is very, very good. So I think this is a solid card that's definitely worth checking out in pure black builds. Next, we have Crocodile. I'm actually surprised to see Crocodile make it, and it's actually running an impel down engine. That's super neat. So the first thing of note is the impel down engine. So for buggy and to maximize consistency, you have the Bentham, you have the Ivankov and Luffy combo, and that's it for the impel down. But just to get that consistency, I think makes sense. They are opting to run a small Sentomaru engine as well, but they're only running 4 of the Pacifistas collectively. So those numbers are a bit confusing to me personally. Love Beam for the draws. I'm actually... Oh, and then there it is. Doflamingo for the added consistency, because I'm guessing if you don't have the pieces for Ivankov and Luffy in your hand or in the top 5, you just get rid of them. I think I actually just undersold how potent of a duo these two are in my initial analysis, which is absolutely on me. This is why I like to do the videos as soon as we hear it out, just so you can all make fun of me for being wrong. I do think that I absolutely undersold just how impactful it can be just to get us 2 cards of 7k out for a cost of 7, and I think that's what's really helping this. And I think Crocodile as a leader can definitely make sense for that, because you can help stall games by bouncing things if you need to. I am surprised by the lack of events, however. I thought you would have wanted Desert Spada for added consistency and protection, or more blockers, because while we have Law and Doflamingo, we only have the one Pacifista, but we do have a lot of 2k counters, so I think it actually does make sense why it looks like that. So this is a pretty interesting list, which I'm actually glad to see Impel Down doing well. Next, we have another Crocodile list. This one, however, is actually a pure Crocodile. The only cards from Set 2 that we see are the new Vanilla Mihawk and some of the events. So I think these events were quite impactful. I think these ones make sense just because 0 cost is always good on an event counter, and having the discard means it can potentially proc a Love Beam on itself, which I think is quite interesting. Deathwink as well for additional draws, and then you have a lot of suspects like sending things to the bottom of deck, with Mihawk Jinbei bouncing with Doflamingo and potentially Crocodile. A lot of counters just to slow the game down while you slowly whittle them down. I think it's interesting that they are opting to run the 7-cost Crocodile, which I don't think in any of the Set 1 meta analyses I did we saw. So it has Banish and Dawn 1, your blue events get cost -1. So I think that makes the Deathwink and Love Beam even better, because it makes them a lot cheaper, and having Banish natively is always good. So now we have our runner-up, which is Zorro. This is the first Zorro we've seen, actually, and once again, this is the vast majority of it is Set 1, the only difference being the addition of Vista. But I think a lot of this is what we come to expect from a Zorro list. We have the consistency. Surprised there's only one Nami, just because I thought you'd want to add Dawn consistently turn over turn. The Rush Sanji makes sense. Rush Luffy makes sense. Ignoring blockers with Diabo Jambe, and then countering and killing, always great. And then Jet Pistol. So I think a lot of this definitely makes sense for a Red Zorro. But yeah, because this is a largely Set 1 list, there isn't much to say. And then first off, we have Kaido! They weren't just chilling in the bottom. Kaido was still winning the event. So, I think the first thing of note is, once again, there's not a single Set 2 card in this list, and beyond that, there's nothing new to say about this that I was saying about all of the other Kaido decks we've looked at. We have a solid amount of blockers and 2k counters. We have all of these high-cost cards that hit high numbers. They are opting to run Fukurokuju just because it's an 8k beater. They're also opting to run Thunder Bagua just because I think having the 4k counter is definitely helpful, and if you are at low life, being able to Dawn ramp will certainly be helpful, especially after a long turn, or like if the turn before you went -6 off of Kaido, then next turn you would have -4, and getting one more off of that would be definitely helpful. So I want to say a big congratulations to everybody who made top 16, especially to the winner, for being able to show them that power creep doesn't need to exist, and that Set 1 is still quite strong. So I think there's a couple things that we need to talk about right off the bat, is how there wasn't a whole lot from Set 2. There was a total of 1, 2, 3, 4 leaders from Set 2, and I believe another 1, 2, 3, 4, for another 4 decks that are using decent amounts of set 2 cards in any capacity. So I think it's pretty interesting. I don't know if that's a sign that set 2 was too weak or set 1 was just too strong. I would prefer it to not have a ban list this early, especially if because Kaido, well, it was primarily dominated by pure Kaidos. There was still the one Kaido with the Impel down deck. So Kaido took over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They took 5 slots in the event. So 5 of the top 16 is dedicated to Kaido variants, which is just over 33%, which is quite a lot for a single deck. And I think another thing that's very interesting to note is how there was only the one Kid deck. Kid seems to have completely fallen off for the most part, and I'm not sure if that is indicative of this specific area's meta, or if because this meta is so largely set 1, and set 1 is so largely solved, we all know the answers to Kid, and Kid is finally being answered. So I think Kaido performing like that is definitely a sign of a shifting meta. I'm glad to see blue is getting better. Blue seemed to, from set 1, kind of be the forgotten color with the least amount of tops, I believe, overall. But this deck, after purple, I think blue was the most represented color, with a total of 5 decks as well, 2 Dofi, 2 Croc, and 1 Ivankov. So I'm glad that blue is doing well. And I'm not one to say, I'm not too proud to admit when I'm wrong. I undersold the Impel down cards, maybe not as a pure deck, but the engine of Ivankov and Luffy just seems to be so good that it's really uprooting the meta, and being able to get all of these big hitters out and getting the advantage that they provide, I think, is definitely providing a lot of help for the blue in the meta. So I think blue might have been the winner out of set 2. So I think that kind of wraps it up for a lot of the long-term implications. I'm curious to see if things do end up changing. Well, of course, I could be wrong in this. To me, it seemed as though the decks out of set 2 were by and large simpler than the decks out of set 1 as well. Set 1 was the first set, so people's grasp on the game was a bit more tenuous. Now that we've had, say, I think 5, 6, 7 months since it first came out, now that set 2 is. So I think it's interesting that set 1 is so prevalent. Maybe set 2 just wasn't overall as strong, but I'm curious to see how the meta change if we do end up seeing more set 2. And I'm kind of curious about what happens to Kaido, because Kaido was one of the 2 best decks out of set 1, at least after the film support, and now it seems to be the clear deck to beat if this an event is going to be indicative of things to come. So I think it has a lot of interesting implications, and I'm just beyond excited to see how the meta evolves from here on out. My last thoughts, and seeing how set 2 impacted the game, is I'm still very happy that the game is as diverse as it is. I think one deck having over 30% of top 16 is a bit too much. I would have liked it to be a bit more diverse, but 5 out of 16 isn't a absurdly large amount. And if you look at the decks after that, there are so many other decks that put up a fight, because while Kaido did end up winning the event, the other 4 variants were the bottom of top 16, assuming that this is in the right order, where this was 16, 15, 14, and 13. So even though Kaido seems to be the strongest by how consistently it can get these wins, the meta is so diverse. There are so many leaders and so many different ways to build the same leader, as we've seen from all of the Kaidos, and how all of the blue decks have been incorporating similar cards in different ways. So I said this at the end of a lot of my set 1 videos, and I think my set 1 meta analyses, but stuff like this really is what makes me so happy to play this game. This meta is so diverse. Power creep is not ruining it yet. The set 1 is still kicking hard. The set 2 stuff is making interesting changes to builds. There really are so few wrong choices of decks to pick if you want to win an event. So many things are competing well, and that just makes me happy. I think it's so neat how it really does seem to be like it's up to the pilots to know what they are doing and to know timing, and then you can win with seemingly anything. I doubt, to go back into the archives, I downplayed the original Luffy when I first started this channel, and not only did it do well out of set 1, it's still kicking in set 2. So I think this is going to wrap it up for me. I went over all of the wins, all of the decks, all of the, I think, implications that we are going to be seeing in the future. Let me know what you think about the start of this new meta. Let me know if there's anything that you thought that I missed. Let me know if you made it into the top 16 so I can congratulate you and not get your name wrong, because I do want to give, once again, a high congratulations to everybody who made it this far in the event. And thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.